666.
Move on to our first of two security-related topics today, since we have an expert with us. David, you wrote a great piece recently for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington on Saudi Arabia's Patriot buys and the political aspects of missile defense. As you note in the article, Saudi security conditions are, quote, continuing to deteriorate. Over 300 attacks have been launched into the kingdom in the last year alone. And the current problem is that the kingdom is running out of missiles to defend itself against such attacks from Iran and the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. This seems just like a great place to start. For our listeners, really quickly, check out his piece for the AGSIW, which is just fantastic. But I'm going to kick it over to you, Dave. Let's talk a little bit about the status of the U.S. Saudi security relationship.
Yeah, good question. So it's still robust. It's still very active. There's still a large presence, American presence in the kingdom, and that presence is focused on enabling Saudi capacities. Most people think that there are U.S. offensive capabilities in Saudi Arabia. That wasn't the case from 2003 to 2019. After the Abqaiq attacks, the United States agreed to put some more, actual combat forces in. But most of the presence is actually training, advising, assisting, things like that. And that's still robust. So in the last year, I've lectured for 2 weeks at Saudi War College, which is amazing. You think about that, an American doing that. There's ongoing upgrades and modernizations across the spectrum of the Saudi defense establishment. But what has happened is, particularly during the Trump administration, two things. First, you've had the rise of the Crown Prince, which remains controversial, and the actions of the Crown Prince, are controversial. Then you had the war in Yemen, which has not gone well. And has kind of become a sort of litmus test for people who are unhappy with Saudi Arabia. And then, because President Trump was so inartful in expressing policies that, quite frankly, are exactly the same as Barack Obama had, but poorly sold. People forget the war in Yemen started. If there was an American green light for the war in Yemen, that was given by Barack Obama. But people forget that. And during the Trump administration, opposing Saudi Arabia became sort of a proxy way of opposing Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So you have Joe Biden, in the presidential campaign saying Saudi Arabia needs to be made a pariah. Well, then he becomes president. And, there's a longstanding conflict there. And the rules of governments are very different from the rules of campaigning. And so the question is, okay, what do we do with this long-standing security partner? What the Biden administration has done is what we see quite frequently, and I think it's a false distinction. They said, well, we'll only sell defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. Some weapons are easier to make that case for than others. Patriot, which is a ground-to-air missile system, that intercepts that. Other systems like precision-guided munitions that have been used in the Yemen war are harder. So the Biden administration is trying to thread the needle here. It's trying to keep its own party base from outset revolt. There are some people in the Democratic Party who want to see a total cessation of the security relationship with the kingdom until the Crown Prince steps down, until the war in Yemen stops, et cetera, et cetera. The pragmatic wing is trying to say, okay, these weapons good, these weapons bad. But meanwhile, it's without doubt that Saudi Arabia is under constant attack by missiles provided by Iran. In the next 5 years, probably domestically produced. And they need support. And they're running out of Patriot missiles. So, what we're seeing now is the Biden administration going forward with that on a commercial basis, and probably on a foreign military sales basis. And meanwhile, there are reports that the Saudis are buying excess Patriot from their other GCC partners. They've bought them from Greece. That requires U.S. approval. So it looks as though the United States is, on board with this effort at least, and we'll see where the rest of it goes.
Yeah, it's a bad look, I think, from the U.S. perspective in terms of a partner in this kind of being attacked on a regular basis and having a shortage of U.S. munitions and that sort of thing. But I want to get to a point you made early on and come back to some others. You mentioned that the nature of the relationship is changing in terms of its training. And my understanding is we've had the U.S. military training mission. You submit them, and then also Saudi Arabia National Guard modernization. So OPM sang, since the 50s and the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've been in there a long time. Has training Saudis, and they're sort of point of the spear in terms of the relationship, in terms of that the U.S. Saudi relationship at that level on the ground. And this is really, in my opinion, this and the business community, defense and business community, are the sort of basic sinews of the relationship, because these are where real relationships are struck, long-standing commitments are made, and you have an opportunity to get to know people over time and come to trust people over time. So are things you mentioned, was it 02 to 2019?
It's 03 to 2019, yeah. Was when our combat forces left Saudi Arabia.
All right, so have things changed on the ground in terms of how the U.S. is interacting with its Saudi counterparts in the military?
Yeah, that's a good question. They have generally. There's more positive mood. So, you have the Ministry of Defense Forces. That relationship goes back to the 50s, as you said, and that seems to be on track. The issue, of course, is the administration has said that it's not going to transfer certain kind of offensive weapons. The difference between offensive and defensive weapons is really a geopolitical concept. It's a political concept. It's not a military concept. I went through the Joint Staff Dictionary trying to find a definition of defensive weapons. There's no such thing. But that's a political problem. In terms of the ongoing basis, the training, the assisting, as much as the Saudis want, they get. So, one of the things that I'm involved with is we have a foreign military sales case to help the Saudis stand up a national defense university on the lines of the American National Defense University. And that is really revolutionary. In the past, not just the Saudis, but most security partners of the United States tend to be very equipment focused. I call it the Wile E. Coyote model of defense capacity building. They go through the Acme calendar. They say, okay, we got a problem with drones. All right, here's the Acme drone hunter. Buy it. And that'll solve the problem. But the Saudis have actually said, no, one of the reasons why we are not performing at the level we think we should is because we haven't developed a culture of critical thinking. And so we need to have a war college, a staff college that actually does these, an associated institution that looks at complex issues of developments to get our armed forces ahead. And that's a multi-million-dollar effort where, we've gone from having one officer who, is on the scene to, trained war college faculty, academic faculty, military officers working with the Saudis on that. There's been some other areas where it's unclear what's going on. So the relationship with the National Guard, the training through the Vanel Arabia Corporation has been in place since the 70s. In the last 4 months, the ground component of that has just stopped. And we don't know whether that's because of a conscious decision. People have always, from the outside, are always wondering, is the National Guard, which is basically a redundant army, is it going to be folded into the Ministry of Defense? Are they running it down? We don't know. I mean, the United States has a second army. We have the army that belongs to the United States. We have the army that belongs to the United States Navy, called the United States Marine Corps. So, having this redundancy is not unheard of. But it is, this relationship with the ground forces of the Saudi National Guard from the 1970s until now, and it just ended in the last quarter of last year. So we don't know whether that means they're going to be run down, or whether they just ran out of money, or whether, there was mismanagement, or, we don't know what the deal was with that. The case for the air component of the National Guard is ongoing. So maybe there was a prioritization, we don't know. But in terms of the actual military to military, that's pretty much unchanged. It remains robust. The Saudis are never quite happy with what they get from the United States. The United States is never quite happy with what they see as an unending demand signal from the Saudis. But I don't see any real change in that.
That's a really useful and I think insightful sort of overview of where it is at the working level. I think I'm always interested on any kind of perspective on what the Saudis feel about the relationship, and particularly since Abqaiq and Quraysh in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
This attack was stunning, really. Complete surprise that they weren't prepared for. This is a processing facility that deals with half of their production. I mean, it's just an extraordinary blow in terms of economic. Saudi's economy, and
well, hold on though. Let's give Aramco some credit. Okay, so I think prior to the attack, if you said there was going to be a coordinated, attack by cruise missiles and drones on Abqaiq, how long would it take to get it back in business? And people would say 6 months, a year. It would be catastrophic. And because of resiliency, yes, the active defense measures failed. But the resiliency, which is more important, the passive defense, the fact that they had spares online, that they had trained staff who knew to shut down valves so there wasn't secondary explosions, all that. Abqaiq was back online in 2 weeks, and the effect on the global energy market was momentary. So there was preparation. It just wasn't in the military and security realm.
I mean, and that's a good point, and that's something we spoke of actually in our last episode. When we were talking about the global oil market and the ability, Saudi Arabia is moving from 12 million to 13 million barrels in terms of capacity, and they hope to get there by 2027. But they just put in 4.5 billion into the Zuluf offshore field. The point being is that speaks what you're talking about. That speaks to the Saudi governance and how they've managed their resources. And the fact that they have built-in resiliency and redundancy, and they have spent enormous billions to not only achieve a certain capacity but also preserve the ability to rebound. But I don't think that gives them much comfort that they can bounce back after being revealed to be so vulnerable. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get to. How do the Saudis see this, and do they feel? Yeah. And obviously they're aware. I think everyone has a different take on Afghanistan, and I'm not sure everyone's is correct, or mine may be different. But certainly the Saudis, the question, and to be honest, from their perspective is, apart from a few more Patriot batteries, nothing happened.
Good question.
After that attack, Saudis, how do the Saudis look at this?
Yeah, I think after the attack on Abqaiq, they expected to see the U.S. Air Force bombing, Isfahan. They expected to see a response in kinetic terms. And, one of the things, Donald Trump was a bombastic, undisciplined speaker. He spoke a lot, but when you look at what he actually did, he's the only president in the last 20 years who didn't start another war in the Middle East. He actually, his baseline instincts were pacifistic. And when the Iranians shot down a Global Hawk drone, a U.S. Navy Global Hawk drone in the Straits of Hormuz, there were aircraft en route to bomb, Iranian targets. And Trump reportedly said, wait a minute, nobody was killed on this. I'm not going to start a war, over equipment, call them back. What we're hearing is that there was a cyber attack against the Iranian infrastructure, but clearly that didn't satisfy the Saudi desire.
This post-Abqaiq.
Post-Abqaiq, yeah.
Yeah, there was a cyber attack.
With the U.S. directed cyber stuff like that. But, what the Saudis expected was a parallel sort of kinetic,
right.
They wanted to see bombs landing on Iranian infrastructure. And, it's a good question. If that's what they expected, we got to ask ourselves, why did they expect that? And it's because of statements and actions we've taken, or statements and actions we haven't taken. And, if the nature of the relationship is one that they are not comfortable with, it calls for high level discussions as to, what exactly, we're willing to do for them. The other problem is, you're right about Afghanistan. In the U.S. government, Afghanistan is seen as its own problem. In the Pentagon, Afghanistan is it belongs to a separate assistant secretary of defense than the Middle East. The Middle East starts at Egypt and ends at the Iranian Afghan border. And that goes up to the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, which is going to be Celeste Wallander Gewinter. She has her hearing, I think, today. And then the Afghanistan, Pakistan belong to the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, who spends 98% of his time dealing with China and Korea and Japan. So, we have it bifurcated. We see them as two different issues. And I never worked Afghanistan in the Pentagon. I worked in the Army on the ground, but I did work Pakistan. And I can tell you that most of the issues being dealt with were Afghanistan as its own issue, or Afghanistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, wasn't seen as having any impact on the Middle East except as a logistic base. But the problem is, first off, the Iranians saw it as encirclement from the East. By the way, kind of funny, if we encircle them from the East, the fact that we've left should mean that they could stand down some of their military capacity, but they haven't. And then our friends in the Gulf, I'm sorry, I'm being a little long-winded here. Our friends in the Gulf said, you're in the neighborhood, you're gone, we're naked. And I'm not quite sure how we can deal with those perceptions. There is this perception, and quite frankly, I've felt it since the announcement of the pivot in the Obama administration in 2009. And the pivot was away from Europe, not from the Middle East. But ever since that was announced, folks in the region have said, oh my God, the Americans are leaving. We're on our own. The Iranians are going to, reduce us to servitude. And I don't know how you can, it's like arguing with your wife, when you say you're being irrational, oh my God, you can't argue a person into seeing that. Yeah.
Well, and this is the challenge we have, because that certainly the perception is out there of a U.S. that's distracted, withdrawing, and consciously redirecting. And you see at the end of 2021, Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, a series of senior administrative officials, although Secretary of Defense Austin did not stop in Saudi, going out there to try and reassure them, and I gather that some of the there's been some redeployment to the west of the country in terms of assets and that sort of thing, but it is a challenge, as you say, because your discussion of theater management and marshaling the U.S., how the U.S. addresses the area, doesn't resonate with them. They see something entirely different, and they feel something entirely different. And I think it's a real challenge. It seems to be a real challenge to try and reassure them if there's something to reassure them about.
Yeah, no, the problem is, and this is not limited to the Middle East. You see this in Japan and Korea and Europe. If you have U.S. forces based someplace, the host nation tends to view those as our forces. So, one of the challenges I've argued in print that we should never put an aircraft carrier in the Gulf. It's stupid. It limits the ability of the aircraft carrier. The ships around it have to devote all their energy to protecting the aircraft carrier that should be in the missile defense mode. Right. Be better to have, sort of isolated bases on the Arab side of the Gulf, fly the planes in there, project the power that way. That way you have something that can't be sunk and kill 2,000 people at once. But, very senior people in the Saudi government and other are like, why is there not an aircraft carrier in the Gulf? They freak out over that. They've come to see it as an entitlement. And when it's not there, they see it as the United States sort of reneging on informal security commitments.
So sorry to interrupt, if I were listening to this conversation, I might conclude that it's a communication breakdown. Is that all it is? Or are there some philosophical changes?
Well, there's a couple of problems. So the first problem is, at its basis is a communication issue. I mean, when I went, as you can tell by my accent, I went to graduate school in London, right? So when I went there in 1989, my mom and my dad were freaking out because they were saying, oh my gosh, it's Europe, there's terrorism there. And I was able to show them figures. I said, look, I was born in Los Angeles County. My chances of dying a violent death are greater as a male in Los Angeles County than there are if I were a British soldier in Northern Ireland.
Especially with your crack habit.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was scuba diving then. Another expensive habit. there's that perception. Americans think, I mean, when I go to the Middle East, and I go frequently, the greatest threat is of traffic. You know that,
right?
And the Saudis will tell you that, but everybody freaks out over terrorism. And I mean, geez, I worked in the Pentagon for 12 years. The 9/11 attacks. I mean, so there is that perception. That's problem number one. Problem number two is, and again, this goes back to the Obama, Trump, Biden thing. Trump was so, used phrases like "my favorite dictator," stuff like that, which allowed his political adversaries in the other party to, stand against him. And, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, none of them are democracies. And so it's very easy for a person who wanted to score a point on Trump to say, okay, we're against this. The problem is they've painted themselves into a corner. And now that they're in power, you have this elaborate game where President Biden refuses to take a phone call from Mohammed bin Salman, who, everybody knows is running the show in the kingdom because it's not his parallel. Well, okay, Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE is only the crown prince of Abu Dhabi. Are you not going to take his call? Theoretically, Boris Johnson is not Joe Biden's parallel. Queen Elizabeth is. She's the head of state. So, there's a lot of ridiculousness that, is over the Khashoggi murder and things that were said in the primaries that, the president's painted himself into a corner, and it has to do with the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party, which, elements of it have moved further to the left. And then the final problem is just institutionally, things like Patriot batteries are high demand, low density. And when you deploy a Patriot battery on an emergency basis to Abqaiq in 2019, people tend to forget that the soldiers who come with that, those are guys who have probably been, on a remote air base in the Middle East for a year. And they were promised, okay, this is your year back at Fort Bliss or Fort Sill. And, you can go to your kid's high school graduation, all that. And all of a sudden, nope, sorry, back to the desert. And so what you see is that the sergeants, you can't just hire guys for a Patriot battery. You have to build them over years. A lot of those guys weren't re-enlisting. There is stress on the force, and it's not just equipment, it's also the personnel. And, so people tend to overlook that. And so there's a lot of factors that reinforce what at the end of the day is a fundamental insecurity, which is, how committed is the United States to us? We live in this region, you don't. And so whenever it looks like we're diminishing our participation in the region, the fears come to the forefront.
That's interesting when you talk about perceptions when there are American troops on the ground. The host nations come to think of them as their own, and it's also what you just said about the basic bureaucracy of an entity, an organism as large as the U.S. military, and taking care of its people. And there's always the assumption that it's a bottomless well in terms of capacity and availability and capability, which. Anybody that's in the military knows it's not that. It's a plenty nightmare.
Oh yeah. Oh no, and this is a universal problem. Just in the domestic context, we've got Corona surging here, and you hear all these governors say we need to call out the National Guard. And it's like, well, the National Guard is not. They're not kept hermetically sealed. These are people who have jobs, and particularly if you say you want a medical person from the National Guard or the Army Reserve. Well, they're part-time soldiers. If they are in a medical specialty, the chances are pretty good they're working in their civilian capacity in a medical job. So if you call them out as National Guardsmen, you're going to see like a doctor leaving his job at one hospital to put on a uniform and work at another hospital. What have you gained? That's in the domestic context. It's the same thing in the international context. You've got countries that are like, well, why aren't there soldiers here? What are they doing? And the answer is, they're people and they're on a cycle. And when you had that deployment to Abqaiq, you disrupted that cycle. And that hurts the institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just as an aside, that example you just made is very close to home. My son's, a very good friend of my son's, is a nurse in San Antonio with the Army. So she's there with the hospital there. She spent the last 6 months in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, helping out people because hard hit areas that have been hard hit by COVID and who can't get nurses and can't pay the nurses to get them to come in. So the military is trying to fill this gap domestically, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
As I said, it's not a bottomless well, and you can't just go to it whenever you have a need.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Afghan refugees have been settled at Fort Bliss, Texas, and I've heard informally, so I don't know how true this is, that the entire 1st Armored Division is basically consumed with that mission. So we only have 9 divisions in the U.S. Army, and you've got one of those offline doing an extraneous mission. And the problem, I was the Department of Defense's liaison at the Department of Homeland Security for 3 years. And I noticed in all the planning for hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemic influenza, terrorist strikes, the rest of the U.S. government would plan up to wildfires. They'd plan up to a certain point, and then they'd say, call in the Department of Defense. So we do that domestically. There was like this mental line where the problem became too hard, and they said, "Oh, we'll give it to the Department of Defense."
we can't think about this anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, another question, and maybe this is our next segment is going to be on Saudi efforts to build a military industry. But how do we deal with what they're dealing with now? What is actually sort of characteristic of modern warfare, and these are asymmetrical, low cost, drones, missiles that are very difficult to defend against, and as you pointed out in your excellent article, extremely expensive. We're basically trading $20,000 at the most, for a souped up drone for $1 million Patriot. How
$4 million Patriot.
Oh, all right, there you go. Yeah, inflation. I didn't know inflation hit so quickly.
Well, and no, it's a good point. Well, theoretically, if you look at Vision 2030, if it holds, smaller states have an advantage in this new warfare because they're nimble and they haven't invested all the money in the big infrastructure that we have. So if you go to the U.S. Navy and give them any problem and listen to their answers, how would you solve this? You'll realize that their thinking is, how can we base the possible solution to this on an aircraft carrier or a littoral combat ship? They tend to think in terms of the systems they have and justifying those. Saudi Arabia has imported all that. They don't have that domestically. And they're trying to build a domestic defense industry. You start small. So they have, 11 areas of emphasis in their defense industry. One of them is developing UAVs. Another one is developing the maintenance and overhaul, repair and overhaul for UAVs. So, theoretically, starting from a base there where you don't have those fixed costs, and you succumb to the gambler's dilemma where you say, we've spent so much on this, we have to justify it. This is what the U.S. Navy does with aircraft carriers. Then you can move more nimbly, approach these things with a clean sheet and say, okay, how can we defeat these? And so another one of these, two of the Saudi things are directed energy, and they're also looking at development of defense electronics, electronic warfare. Those are promising areas for counter drone defense.
Fascinating. We're going to make you repeat that for our next segment. But I had one more question that I think fits into this security situation. And Lucian, jump in. I'm sure. I've been rolling along here. Saudi 2022 defense budget for Saudi, they're cutting it 10%, and this is the 5th consecutive year they've cut it. So it's going down from $57 billion to $45.5 billion. And as we know, Saudi Arabia has been a reliable, purchaser of arms and at extraordinary levels with regard to its GDP. What do you make of that?
It's kind of normal. I mean, first off, a lot of the Saudi defense budget does not equal what is spent to defend the Saudi state. So, you've got the National Guard, you've got new presidential security. A lot of the Ministry of the Interior serves as a sort of army. So There's still a lot more there than we think, but I think a lot of the spikes reflected procurement spikes. So the F-15 recapitalization is on course and trickling down. We've seen the completion of the Patriot modernization. We're told that there'll be another modernization and expansion of Patriot the next few years, but that's not baked into the budget. So, and, hopefully if there is effective reform, at least in the short term, things that are produced in Saudi Arabia are going to be more expensive than they could be produced overseas. But if Saudi Arabia actually manages to achieve a true sustained industrial base, defense industrial base, you should, within about 10 years, I think, start to see costs fall down. Right now, this is a cynical view, but I'm a cynical dude. So far, what Saudi Arabia is succeeding in doing in domestic defense production is building the most expensive, metal boxes for an Apache helicopter fire control unit. But as, learning and industries take root, if they do, you should see efficiencies and price reductions. And Saudi Arabia will start getting more bang for the buck instead of less.